Rain fell over the city of Greyford like thin glass needles, and the streets shone under pale lamplight. Kaito was only 20, with black hair, a gray jacket, and the tired look of a young man who had spent too many nights working late. He had no idea that this ordinary evening would split his life in two. Across the old station square, a crack of white light opened in the air, and the ground shook as if a giant hand had struck the world. From that tier, a voice called his name, even though no one there should have known it. Before Kaito could run, the light wrapped around him and pulled him away from pavement, rain, and the only life he knew. In the world he entered, the air smelled of smoke and iron, and the first thing he saw was a broken wall, a burning field, and soldiers in battered armor running for their lives. This strange land was called Westmere, and it was already losing a war against monsters at its borders. The central danger was simple and terrible. If Westmere fell, every nearby kingdom would collapse with it, and the holy balance of the realm would begin to erase whole nations to restore order. Kaito did not know any of that yet, but he knew one thing at once. He was lost, and he was standing in a war that did not care whether he belonged there or not. Soon after, he met Myra, a woman with blue-black hair, sharp eyes, and a commander coat covered in dust. She led the surviving defense line, and she wanted one thing above all else: to keep her people alive through another night. Beside her stood Tom, a man with brown hair and a broken shield, a tired veteran who wanted nothing more than to protect the gate he had guarded for 10 years. They both stared at Kaito like he was either a miracle or a problem, and in truth, he was already both. Myra brought Kaito to the last watch camp outside Westmere, where he learned the rule that shaped this whole world. In this realm, every fighter could witness one skill and copy it only once in their life. A soldier might learn one perfect sword cut, one shield break, or one healing step, but never that skill again. That rule made training sacred and made errors final, because every choice mattered forever. The people of Westmere trusted the strong, but they feared waste, because a wasted copy could never be replaced. Kaito listened, confused and uneasy, until a training clash began nearby. A young guard with blonde hair tried to copy a spear move from a veteran, but he duplicated the motion too early, left his side open, and got pushed back at once. Kaito saw the mistake, and something inside him answered. The weakness did not vanish, it sharpened. He felt the shape of the failed move settle into his mind, then change, then become cleaner and faster than the original. When he moved, his body duplicated the weakness itself and perfected it into a form no one had ever taught him. Myra noticed it first. Her face went still, then hard, because she understood what that meant before anyone else did. Kaito was not merely copying one skill once. He was taking any weakness he witnessed and turning it into a perfected combat form. That made him priceless, but it also made him dangerous, because the realm had rules, and anything that broke the rules drew attention. Myra wanted to test him, while Tom wanted to protect him, and far away, hidden in a stone tower, Lord Vance began to hear that a stranger had arrived. Vance was the ruler of the Silver Court, a man with white hair, a cold smile, and a calm voice that always sounded planned. He wanted the hidden law of the world for himself, because he believed the law belonged to the strongest hand, and if he could command it, he could control every kingdom before the holy balance erased his rivals. That was his motive, simple and cruel. He did not want peace. He wanted to rule what remained after the cleansing. The next battle came at dusk, when monster horns sounded from the eastern marsh. Kaito followed Myra to the broken wall, where black-scaled creatures poured forward in packs, driven by hunger and by the scent of fear. The defense line shattered in small places, and soldiers were forced to retreat step by step. Myra fought with a long spear, fast and proud, but one monster slipped past her timing and nearly reached Tom. Kaito moved before he understood what he was doing. He watched the beast twist its body, saw the flaw in its charge, and felt his strange power seize that weakness. His stance changed in one breath, and his hands moved with a calm that did not belong to his former life. He struck the monster aside, then duplicated the broken rhythm of its attack and perfected it into a counter form. The result was shocking. He was not stronger in the usual way, but he was faster at seeing where every enemy failed. With each failure he witnessed, he became more complete. Then he drew the living iron blade that had been waiting for him since the summoning. The sword looked plain at first, dark and heavy, with a dull edge and a faint pulse inside the metal, like a heart trapped in stone. When Kaito held it, the blade warmed, then shifted, then stretched into a sharper shape as if it recognized danger. Myra called it an iron remnant. remnant, but the old smith of the camp, a woman named Helen with gray hair and stained hands, knew better. She said the sword was alive in its own quiet way, and it fed on battle to change its form. That meant every clash would make it stronger. The fight at the wall ended with the monsters driven back, but not before the camp saw Kaito cut through fear itself. People who had doubted him now watched him with hope, while others watched him with worry. Kaito, for his part, only stared at his own hands, because he finally understood that the world had given him a power that could grow without limit, but only if he kept facing what was hard, broken, and ugly. That same night, Myra told him the truth she had been hiding. Westmere had not summoned him by accident. Long ago, the kingdoms of the realm made a pact with the hidden law, a law that rewarded balance by copying strength and punishing excess by cleansing the weak. Yet the law had become unstable, and someone had started feeding it false signs. Now the holy light was moving from land to land, not as mercy, but as a system reset that would wipe out any nation judged too unbalanced to remain. Kaito asked who would do such a thing, and Myra answered with one name: Lord Vance. He had been sending false reports to the realm of light, telling it that whole nations had fallen beyond repair, because he wanted rival kingdoms erased before they could unite against him. That was the twist hidden beneath the war. The enemy was not only monsters, it was a man who was cheating the world itself. The real duel came before dawn, when Sky Knights descended through the clouds in silver harnesses and winged cloaks, their armor shining like frozen moonlight. Their leader was Drake, a stern man with red hair and a cruel sense of duty, and he had come with an order from Lord Vance to seize Kaito alive. Drake believed the realm had already marked Kaito as an error, and he wanted to hand that error over before the cleansing began. The fight broke over the shattered courtyard of an old fortress, with winds screaming through cracked towers and banners whipping in the dark. Drake used one duplicated skill after another, each one perfect, each one limited, because the world would not allow him to learn twice. Kaito was overwhelmed at first, because Drake had years of training and the confidence of a man who trusted the rules. But Kaito watched closely, saw the tiny delay in each aerial turn, the one weakness hidden inside the knight's style, and his power turned that weakness into his own perfected form. He duplicated the timing, not the power, and then improved it in a single breath. The living iron blade answered, splitting into a longer edge, then folding into a narrower curve, each change matching the rhythm of battle. Kaito climbed onto a broken tower wall, met Drake in the air, and forced him back with one clean strike that carried no waste. Drake left angry but not defeated in spirit, because he realized Kaito was becoming the one thing the hidden law feared most. In the ruin after the duel, Helen brought news from the south. Another kingdom had vanished under holy light that had fallen like a silent sun, leaving only white ash and empty roads. The people of Westmere saw that and finally understood the scale of the threat. If Vance kept feeding the law, the cleansing would spread until every border became a blank place on the map. Kaito stood with Myra and Tom on a ruined stair, looking toward the horizon where the light had touched the earth, and for the first time he stopped asking how he had arrived there. Instead, he asked why he had been chosen. That question mattered because the answer would decide whether he stayed a lost stranger or became the one person able to challenge the system before the whole realm was reset. The wind rose again, the sword in his hand throbbed like a living pulse, and far away in the silver court, Lord Vance smiled at the beginning of the next phase of his plan. What Kaito did not know yet was that the voice which called his name in Greyford had not been a mistake at all, and the law that summoned him had been waiting for someone exactly like him. Westmere lay under a low gray sky where broken walls, wet stone, and burned fields made the world feel tired before sunrise. The camps around the city stood in rough lines, with lanterns shaking in the wind and guards watching every road with sharp eyes. Kaito stood near the edge of that ruin, still wearing his gray jacket and travel pants, still looking like a man who had taken one wrong step into another life. He was young, lean, and fair-skinned, with black hair damp from the mist and a stunned face that was trying hard to become brave. In his hand, the living iron blade gave off a slow pulse, as if it were breathing with him. That sword mattered because it was not only a weapon but a key, and everyone in Westmere feared the law that had summoned him from Greyford for a reason no one had fully explained yet. If Kaito failed now, the whole realm would be reset by Lord Vance, and every person in Westmere would lose the freedom to choose their own lives. Myra was the first to step toward him, and she made a hard first impression without saying a kind word. She was a woman with blue-black hair, sharp eyes, and a strong athletic build, wearing a dust-covered commander coat over dark armor that had seen many hard days. Her face carried pride, caution, and the heavy weight of command, because she led the broken defenders of Westmere and could not afford trust that was not earned. She wanted one thing above all else, and that was to keep her people alive long enough to outlast Vance. Tom stood behind her, a man with brown hair, weathered skin, and a sturdy build, wearing a battered guard uniform with a broken shield strap and layered boots. His tired face still held loyalty, because he had stayed with Westmere even when hope had become thin. Helen came next, and she was a woman with gray hair, strong hands, and a stocky build, wearing a leather smith apron over a dark tunic, her face marked with soot and long work. She wanted the same thing as any good builder and protector, which was to keep the walls standing and the people fed. Helen looked at the sword in Kaito's hand and knew at once that it was not ordinary iron. She told them all that the blade was a relic from the old system, a tool made to answer a chosen bearer, and that Vance had spent years hunting for that bearer because only such a person could resist the final reset. Kaito did not understand all of that at once, but he understood enough to feel the pressure in his chest. He had been taken from Grayford, a rain-soaked modern city with train stations, street lamps, wet pavement, and tall buildings, and he had expected confusion, not war. He remembered the voice that had called his name in the gray rain, and now that memory felt less like a mistake and more like a trap with a purpose. Myra demanded to know whether he was a tool of Vance or a real ally, because she had already seen too many tricks and false promises. Kaito answered honestly that he did not know who chose him, but he did know that he wanted to go home only if his home could still remain a place where people made their own choices. That answer changed the air between them a little, because it was not brave in a loud way, but it was real. Tom nodded first, since he understood plain fear and plain honesty better than grand speeches. Helen then took Kaito toward a forge tent at the center of camp, where she asked him to hold the blade near the fire. When he did, the dark metal pulsed harder, and fine lines of light ran through it like a living map. Helen said the sword was responding to his will, but also to his memory, because the original law of the blade did not make a master from strength alone. It made a master from someone who refused to let the world decide who he was. That was the first small revelation, and it lifted Kaito from confusion into the start of purpose. Far away in the Silver Court, Lord Vance watched all of it from a high chamber of polished stone and silver banners. He was a man with white hair, pale skin, and a tall, thin build, dressed in a silver court robe with dark trim and a polished mantle that made him look calm, cold, and untouchable. His smile never reached his eyes, because he did not rule through rage but through systems, laws, and clean obedience. Vance did not want the realm reset because he hated people, although he did not care about them either. He wanted it because order was easier to control when fear had no memory and resistance could never grow roots. Long ago, he had learned that a divided kingdom could still rise against a cruel throne, but a reset realm would return every soul to a weaker state, with old bonds erased and new rules written by the crown. Kaito was dangerous to him for one simple reason: the summons from Grayford had searched across worlds for someone whose will could hold shape against the reset, and Kaito had answered. That was why the law had been waiting. That was why the voice had called his name. And that was why Vance now sent Drake, his best Sky Knight, to break Kaito before he learned too much. Drake was a man with red hair, sharp features, and a wiry athletic build, wearing silver Sky Knight armor, a winged cloak, and a fitted battle harness with a severe face full of pride. He wanted glory, rank, and the approval of Vance, and he believed that loyalty to the crown was the same thing as honor. The attack came at dusk when the wind turned colder and the camp lights began to glow. Drake dropped from the dark sky on silver gliders, and his armored boots struck the campground with enough force to shake loose dust and sparks. He raised a polished spear of pale metal and called Kaito a lost stranger who had no place among real warriors. Myra stepped forward first, sword ready, and Tom braced beside her with his broken shield strap pulled tight as best he could. Helen pulled workers behind the forge carts, while Kaito lifted the living iron blade with both hands and felt its pulse race against his grip. Drake moved fast, striking the air with clean, sharp attacks that forced the defenders back and split their line apart. He did not fight like a madman, he fought like a man who believed rules would protect him. Kaito stumbled once, then caught himself when the blade in his hand shifted shape with a sudden hot surge, growing longer and sharper as if it had heard his fear and answered with strength. The change shocked everyone, and it shocked Kaito most of all because the sword was not just reacting to danger, it was teaching him how to use it. Myra shouted for him to stop thinking and start trusting his body, and he did. He moved with the sword instead of against it, and when Drake pressed too hard, Kaito turned the blade and sent the Sky Knight sliding backward through the mud, driven back hard enough to wreck his clean formation. Drake recovered quickly, but the first crack had already opened in his pride. Then came the twist that changed everything. As Kaito held the blade steady, Helen recognized the pattern of its pulse and rushed closer with an old forge lamp in her hand. She looked at the hilt, then at Kaito, and then at Myra with a face that had gone pale beneath the soot. Helen said the blade was not only a relic but a sealed record, and its inner mark matched the founding law of Westmere itself. Long ago, before Vance rose to power, the kingdom had been built with a safeguard. If a ruler tried to erase the will of the people, the law would call an outsider who could break the system from inside it. The outsider was never chosen by blood. He was chosen by refusal. Kaito was not an accident. The voice in Greyford had been the law itself, calling to the one person who could survive the reset and challenge it. Myra stared at him in shocked silence because she had spent days wondering whether he was a spy, and now she saw that he was something far more dangerous to Vance. He was the answer to a plan older than the throne. Kaito felt that truth hit harder than any blow. He was no longer just confused. He was being asked to carry the hope of a kingdom that did not know him, and that weight frightened him more than Drake ever could. Drake heard enough of the truth to understand that his mission had changed, and his face hardened at once. If Kaito was the key, then Vance would not let him live freely, and Drake would not let him escape. He rose into the air again and sent a shock of silver force into the camp yard, smashing crates and scattering ash across the ground. Tom grabbed a fallen support beam and held it in place so others could retreat. Myra ordered the defenders into cover, and for the first time she looked at Kaito not as a stranger but as a possible center of their next stand. Kaito felt the sword pulse faster, as if it wanted him to move toward the source of the attack. He stepped forward, trembling once, then steadied himself. The blade changed again, becoming slim and bright along the edge, and he used it to split the silver force apart without losing his footing. It was not a victory yet, but it was enough to force Drake back into the dark sky. The enemy Sky Knight lingered above the camp for one last cold look, then withdrew toward the silver court with his pride wounded but his mission unfinished. The people in camp did not cheer. They were too worried, too tired, and too aware of the larger danger waiting ahead. Under a torn canvas roof and a dim lantern, Myra finally spoke to Kaito with less doubt and more truth. She said Westmere had lost too many chances already, and she would not waste another one on fear alone. Tom promised to stand beside Kaito if the next fight came, because loyalty meant nothing if it arrived too late. Helen placed a hand on the sword and told Kaito that the blade would keep changing as long as his will kept growing, but it would never choose greed, rage, or empty pride. It would answer only the part of him that still wanted to protect others. Kaito looked down at his hands, then at the wet ground outside the tent, and he remembered Greyford again. He remembered trains, rain, and ordinary people moving through ordinary days without knowing a hidden war waited beyond the mist. He understood then what Vance truly feared. The reset was not only about power. It was about making sure no one ever remembered how to resist. Kaito lifted his eyes and made a quiet promise to himself not to be a hero in a story, but to become someone who would not let the world be rewritten without a fight. Far away in the Silver Court, Lord Vance received Drake again and smiled with patient delight because the next phase had already begun. He had one more law to awaken and one more trap to spring. Above Westmere, the clouds shifted, the living iron blade gave one slow, hard pulse, and Kaito stepped toward the dark road ahead, still afraid, but no longer lost. The road out of Westmere was cold, broken, and full of old smoke, with burned fields on one side and collapsed stone on the other, and the wind moved through them like a tired warning. Kaito walked alone for only a short time before the weight of the day settled in his chest, because he knew the truth now, even if he still did not understand all of it. The living iron blade was not just a weapon, and Lord Vance was not just a ruler. Vance wanted the blade because it could wake old laws buried under the kingdom, laws that could force people, places, and even choices to obey one man. If he finished what he had started, Westmere would not simply fall in battle, but would be rewritten from the inside, and that was far worse. Kaito kept that fear with him as he reached a ridge above the road, where the last light of evening made the clouds look like dark iron. He was still stunned by everything that had happened, still small against the scale of it all, but his steps were steady now, and that mattered more than courage in the moment. Behind him, the battered camp of Westmere struggled to stay alive under a sky that seemed ready to close in. Myra stood near the broken wall, her blue-black hair pulled back and dust clinging to the shoulders of her commander coat, while her sharp eyes watched the guards move supplies between the tents. She was a woman who had learned to lead by standing where others would not, and she wanted only one thing now, to keep the people of Westmere from breaking apart before the next attack came. Tom, a tired man with brown hair, a weathered face, and a broken shield strap hanging from his armor, joined her at the edge of the camp road. He had the steady loyalty of a man who had seen too much and still kept going, and he cared about the camp because it was the last home left for many people who had nowhere else to run. Helen arrived soon after, a woman with gray hair, strong hands, soot on her face, and a leather smith apron over a dark tunic, carrying a heavy tool case with careful pride. She wanted the blade studied, not feared, because she knew metal, heat, and pressure better than anyone in camp, and she had already guessed that the sword was more than iron alone. The three of them gathered around the old work table in the forge tent, where the fire burned low and the air smelled of ash. Myra asked the first hard question, whether Kaito should be trusted with a power that reacted to his touch. Tom answered that Kaito had not asked for any of this but had still stepped forward when others froze. Helen said the blade had answered him for a reason, and reasons always left traces. Words mattered more than she first knew, because the living iron blade gave another pulse when Kaito returned, and the whole tent seemed to hold its breath. The sword lay wrapped in cloth on the work table, dark iron with a faint glow trapped inside the metal, and the pulse moved through it like a quiet heartbeat. Helen studied it with narrowed eyes, then placed a pair of tongs beside it and told Kaito to keep his hand close but not to force anything. She explained the rules slowly and clearly, because the blade was built on old lawwork, the kind that did not care about strength alone. It responded to a person who accepted a burden without trying to own it. It also grew unstable when someone tried to command it through fear or greed. That was why Vance wanted it so badly. If he could awaken all of its laws, he could use them to bind the kingdom under one will, and if the final law opened under the wrong hand, every settlement from Westmere to the Silver Court could be trapped in a new order that none of them could escape. Kaito listened with a dry mouth and a tight chest, because each answer made the world larger and more dangerous. Then the blade shifted shape for the first time in front of them all, stretching into a longer edge with sharper lines before settling again with a cold glow. Myra took one step back. Tom reached for his shield. Helen did not move, but her eyes widened just enough to show surprise. Kaito felt the change through his whole arm, and for one clear moment the sword showed him a flash of silver halls, a tall white-haired man with a calm smile, and a red-haired knight standing at his side. The vision was brief, but it carried a sharp truth. Vance and Drake were already closer than anyone in Westmere thought. Away in the Silver Court, Lord Vance stood in a chamber of polished stone and silver banners, where the light from high windows fell cold across his pale face. He was a tall, thin man with white hair, a dark trim robe, and the kind of calm smile that made even strong people feel like they had already lost. He did not hate Westmere in the simple way that angry men did. He believed order was mercy, and he believed fear was useful when it made people easier to guide. In his mind, the kingdom had become weak because too many hands wanted too many different futures. He wanted one future, his own, and he wanted the old laws to make that future unbreakable. Drake stood before him, a man with red hair, sharp features, and silver sky knight armor that looked polished but hard, like a blade waiting to strike. Drake was proud, severe, and deeply loyal to the promise of a strong realm, yet he was not blind. He wanted Westmere to stop rotting from the inside, and Vance had fed that desire until it became obedience. Vance thanked him for returning, then told him the next phase had begun. One more law would awaken, and one more trap would spring. Drake did not smile. He only bowed and asked where the trap would close. Vance turned toward a sealed window and said the road itself would answer. That was the revelation hiding inside the moment. The road Kaito had just taken was not random at all. It had been chosen so that the blade, the boy, and the coming law would meet in the same place. In Westmere, the camp failed to grow quiet again after the blade vision. Myra demanded to know why Kaito had seen the Silver Court so clearly, and Helen answered before he could, because some lawbound objects carried echoes of the people who shaped them. This blade had been touched by Vance long ago, or at least by the same secret system he now used to control the court. Tom then remembered something that made everyone in the tent turn toward him. Weeks earlier, before the camps were burned and the walls were cracked, he had escorted a court messenger who spoke of a second seal beneath the royal stronghold, a place where the oldest rule of the blade had been chained. He had thought the messenger was only bragging. Now he understood that the messenger had been warning him. Myra took the news hard because it meant the enemy had known far more than they should have, and she had led her people into a war that was already being shaped by hidden hands. She still held herself straight, but doubt touched her face for the first time that night. Kaito saw it and felt something in him shift. Before, he had wanted only to survive and keep out of the center of the storm. Now he understood that fear would not protect anyone if Vance finished the pattern, so he did something new. He spoke clearly, with no grand speech and no false bravery, and told them he would go where the road led, because if the world could be rewritten, then someone had to be there to witness it and fight it. Myra looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod that meant more than praise. It meant she saw him as part of the line now, not just a stranger with a strange weapon. Helen wrapped the blade again and said she would continue studying its laws. Tom offered to guard the camp gates until dawn. For a little while, the camp felt less like a place waiting to fall. Tom did not last because a messenger arrived from the outer watch with rain on his cloak and panic in his eyes, and he said the black road to the north had gone silent. No birds, no wagons, no patrol signals. Just a cold stillness that felt wrong. Myra ordered the gates closed and the torches raised, while Tom rushed out to organize the guards, and Helen grabbed the wrapped blade with careful hands. Kaito moved with them not because anyone told him to, but because he no longer wanted to stand behind others while danger came forward. When they reached the ridge above the camp, they saw the first sign of Vance's work. A line of silver light crossed the road in the distance, like a boundary drawn across the earth itself. It was not a wall, but it behaved like one, pressing the night into a narrow path. Then a shape moved inside it, tall and fast, and Drake appeared through the haze with his winged cloak snapping in the wind. He brought only a small force of sky knights, but their armor gleamed with the same hard light as the trap on the road. Drake raised his hand and the silver line on the ground began to spread. Helen stared at it and whispered that it was the first law waking in the open. Myra tightened her grip on her sword and told the guards to hold their line. Tom planted his feet beside her, battered shield lifted high. Kaito stepped forward last, and the living iron blade answered in his hands with a deep pulse that made the metal grow longer and sharper. Drake looked straight at him from the dark, and his face held no surprise at all. He had expected Kaito to come. That was when everyone understood the full shape of the trap. Vance was not simply chasing the blade anymore. He was guiding Kaito toward the place where the next law could lock onto him. Kaito felt the road beneath his boots tremble, and he knew this was only the beginning. Then the silver boundary surged, the guards shouted, and the night broke open as the battle line formed under the cold sky, with Westmere waiting on one side and the silver court reaching in from the other.
The night over Westmere stayed cold and bright, with silver light cutting across broken stone and ruined fields. The old war camp stood in jagged rows, and the wet ground shone under the moon like glass. On one side waited the tired defenders of Westmere, and on the other side waited the silver court, calm and exact, as if this battle had already been written. Kaito stood near the front line with his black hair damp from mist, his gray jacket hanging open over his dark shirt.
The night over Westmere had turned heavy and cold, and the broken camp held its breath beneath the dark sky. Torches burned low along the shattered wall, their light shaking in the wind, while the wounded stone towers stood like black teeth above the field. Kaito stood near the center of the camp with the living iron blade in both hands, and the sword gave off a deep pulse that matched the slow thump beneath the ground. He was a young man with black hair, fair skin, and a lean build, wearing a gray jacket over a dark shirt and simple travel pants, and his stunned face now carried a hard line of resolve. Around him waited Myra, a woman with blue-black hair, sharp eyes, and a strong athletic build in a dust-covered commander coat over dark armor, along with Tom, a man with brown hair, weathered skin, and a sturdy build, wearing a battered guard uniform and layered boots. Helen, a woman with gray hair, strong hands, and a stocky build, stood close with soot on her face and a leather smith apron over a dark tunic. All of them knew the same thing, even if they said it in different ways, because the hidden force under Westmere was waking, and if they failed to understand it before dawn, the whole kingdom could be dragged into ruin. Myra kept her voice low and sharp because she was the commander who refused to let fear look larger than duty. She wanted the camp to stay calm, she wanted the gate lines repaired, and she wanted proof before she trusted any rumor about the sleeping power below the land. Tom wanted the same safety, but for a different reason, because he had already seen too many people forced to retreat and too many homes reduced to broken stone. Helen cared about the blade in Kaito's hands because she had worked iron for most of her life and could feel that this was no normal weapon. She told them, in plain words, that the metal was not just alive, but awake in small pieces, as if it remembered a shape older than any crown. That frightened Kaito more than he admitted, because the sword had already changed once in battle, and now it was changing again, pulling warmth from his grip and sending a thin glow through the dark. Then the watch horn sounded from the outer ridge, and every head turned at once, because something large had moved beyond the ruined field. Drake arrived through the torchlight like a blade given a human body. He was a man with red hair, sharp features, and a wiry athletic build, wearing silver Sky Knight armor, a winged cloak, and a fitted battle harness. His face was severe and proud, and his eyes held the kind of discipline that came from believing only strength could keep a kingdom standing. He said he had seen movement near the Valley Road, and he warned that Lord Vance would not wait for morning if the hidden power was close to rising. Kaito watched him closely because Drake had helped them before, but there was always a wall around his loyalty, and now that wall seemed even harder to read. Drake wanted order, and he believed Vance wanted the same thing, even if his methods were cold. That made him dangerous in a quiet way, because a man can follow a wrong leader for noble reasons and still help open the door to disaster. Myra noticed the tension at once, and her guarded face hardened as she stepped between them and the camp edge. She did not accuse Drake yet, but she did not trust him either, and that silence cut deeper than words. When the ground shivered again, Helen led them down into an old supply tunnel beneath the broken camp, because she said the shaking was strongest near the roots of the hill. The tunnel air was damp and stale, and the stone walls were marked with old scratches from forgotten tools and older fear. Far below, a chamber opened around a dark well of stone, and there, carved into the floor, was a ring of symbols that Helen had never seen before. She traced them with one rough finger and said the symbols were a warning, not a decoration. The hidden heart under Westmere had once been sealed by people who feared what would happen if anyone tried to command it. Kaito felt the blade pull harder in his hands, and when he lowered it toward the symbols, the iron answered with a bright pulse. Then the floor gave a deep groan, and a narrow crack opened in the center of the ring, letting out a cold wind that smelled like wet stone and old fire. The chamber did not collapse, but it trembled as if something below had heard them speaking. Helen stepped back and said the warning had been clear. If the heart woke in the wrong hands, it would not protect the kingdom, it would turn the kingdom into a weapon. That was when the truth about Lord Vance finally took shape, and it was worse than Kaito had feared. A silver banner was lowered at the tunnel mouth, and Vance himself appeared above them with a small guard line at his back. He was a man with white hair, pale skin, and a tall, thin build, wearing a silver court robe with dark trim and a polished mantle. His smile was calm, cold, and perfectly controlled, and even the torchlight seemed to shrink around him. He told them that he had come to save Westmere from chaos, and he said the sealed power under the hill belonged to the crown by right of duty. His motive was plain now, because he did not want peace alone, he wanted control. He believes that if the heart beneath Westmere could be claimed, then the kingdom could never be threatened again, and he would be the ruler who shaped every border, every army, and every future. The terrible part was that his logic sounded clean enough to fool the frightened. He had not marched here only to destroy. He had come to take the sleeping power before it chose anyone else. Drake stiffened beside him, and for one long moment Kaito thought the Sky Knight had already chosen his side. But Drake did not move to attack. Instead, he asked Vance one direct question, and his voice was rough with suspicion as he demanded to know whether the king intended to seal the heart or chain it. Vance answered with a small, careful smile and said that the crown must always hold what others cannot understand. That answer broke something open in Drake's face because even he could hear the truth inside it. He had followed Vance because he thought discipline would protect the realm, but now he saw that the man in silver wanted power first and safety second. The revelation hit the chamber hard, and it changed the shape of the whole conflict in a single breath. Kaito understood then that the real battle was not only against an outside enemy, but against the idea that fear gave a ruler the right to own everything. In that moment, he also understood why the blade had chosen him. It did not answer the strongest hand. It answered the hand willing to protect without possessing. Vance raised one pale hand, and his guards moved forward with cold precision, not to kill, but to seize. The chamber filled with clashing steel, sharp commands, and the harsh scrape of boots against stone. Myra drew her weapon and drove the first guard back from the tunnel ring, her commander coat flaring as she moved with a strength that made her look like the heart of the defense itself. Tom shoved a second guard away from Helen, using his battered shield strap and sheer stubborn force to hold the line. Helen grabbed a loose iron bar from the tunnel wall and used it to strike the floor beside the cracked seal, which sent a sudden burst of light through the runes and forced Vance to retreat one step. Kaito felt the living iron blade grow hotter, and the dark iron shifted in his hands, lengthening into a sharper form with a thin glowing seam inside the metal. He swung it once, and the blade cut the air with a bright hum that made the chamber answer with another deep tremor. Then the hidden heart below the floor stirred even harder, as if it had recognized the sword and the boy holding it. Drake finally made his choice, and the moment mattered because it came from doubt, not loyalty. He turned away from Vance and moved to Kaito's side, lifting his own weapon to block the next rush of guards. He did not say he was sorry because pride still held his voice, but his actions said enough. He had seen the truth and chosen not to follow it into darkness. That decision saved the chamber from collapse because the guard line faltered when their strongest knight turned against them. Vance watched with a colder smile than before, as if betrayal only confirmed his belief that people could not be trusted with freedom. He ordered a withdrawal, not because he was beaten, but because he had learned what he needed. The heart was waking, the blade was responding, and Kaito would be forced to stand at the center when the next phase began. Before leaving, Vance spoke one last warning, saying that once the heart rose fully, every lie in Westmere would be exposed. Then he vanished into the tunnel shadows, leaving the camp with the most dangerous kind of enemy, one who was patient. After the guards withdrew, the chamber did not go quiet. It grew louder in a deeper way, with stones grinding, air pulling, and the hidden pulse below beating like a second sky. Myra looked at Drake with hard eyes, but she did not waste time on blame because she knew the night had not finished with them. Tom checked the tunnel door and said the outer defenses were still holding, but not for long if the tremors kept growing. Helen stared at the glowing runes and finally admitted the part she had feared to say before. The seal was not only a lock, it was also a test. The sleeping heart had been built to answer the will of the one who understood why power should be guarded, not owned. Kaito listened, and something inside him settled into place. He was still afraid, but the fear no longer ruled his hands. He had begun this war as a stunned boy pulled from Greyford, a rain-soaked city of wet streets and train lamps. Now he stood in a shattered kingdom, holding a living blade with a commander who doubted, a guard who chose truth, a smith who carried old wisdom, and an enemy who wanted to own the future. The ground shook once more, harder than before, and a bright line opened across the seal. From far below came a sound like a giant heart waking at last, and Kaito raised the living iron blade toward the crack of light, ready for whatever would rise next, while everyone around him realized that the next moment could change Westmere forever. Westmere stood under a heavy sky where broken stone walls leaned over blackened fields and tired watchfires flickered in the wind. The kingdom looked worn down, but it was still alive, and that made every danger feel sharper. Deep under the cracked seal, something old was waking, and everyone there could feel the choice before them. If that power broke free in the wrong hands, Westmere would not just lose a battle. It would lose its future, its people, and the hope that anyone could still protect what remained. Kaito stood at the center of that danger, holding the living iron blade with both hands. He was a young man with black hair, fair skin, and a lean build, still looking stunned by how fast his life had changed, yet now his face was hardening into real courage. The sword in his grip gave off a dim pulse inside the dark metal, like a quiet breath inside a sleeping body. Beside him stood Myra, a woman with blue-black hair, sharp eyes, and a strong athletic build, wearing a dust-covered commander coat over dark armor. She had entered this chamber with pride and doubt fighting in her chest because she had spent years trusting orders, and now those orders were starting to fail her. Tom, a man with brown hair, weathered skin, and a sturdy build, wore a battered guard uniform, a broken shield strap, and layered boots. He looked tired, but his loyalty had not broken, and he had chosen truth over easy comfort. Helen, a woman with gray hair, strong hands, and a stocky build, stood close with a leather smith apron over a dark tunic, her soot-marked face set in focused calm. She knew old metal, old fire, and old warnings, and that made her matter now more than ever. Lord Vance watched from the far side of the chamber, a man with white hair, pale skin, and a tall, thin build, wearing a silver court robe with dark trim and a polished mantle. His calm, cold smile never left his face because he did not see people first, only tools, and he believed the future should belong to the one bold enough to seize it. Drake, a man with red hair, sharp features, and a wiry athletic build, stood near him in silver sky knight armor with a winged cloak and a fitted battle harness. Drake had once seemed like a proud soldier, but his severe face now showed the strain of standing between duty and fear. The crack in the seal widened, and the sound below it grew louder, like a giant heart waking inside the mountain. Vance lifted one hand and his guards shifted forward. He wanted the power beneath the seal because he believed a weak kingdom would always be crushed by stronger ones, and only someone ruthless enough to control hidden forces could survive the coming age. That was his logic, cold and simple, and it made him even more dangerous. The first surge came out of the crack as a burst of bright force, and the chamber filled with white wind and shaking stone dust. Tom threw himself in front of Helen when a slab broke loose from the ceiling, and Myra pulled Kaito back just enough to keep him on his feet. The living iron blade flashed brighter in his hands, and for one clear moment it stretched longer and sharper, as if it had chosen to answer the danger itself. Kaito felt that answer in his arms and in his chest, and he understood something important. The blade did not obey strength alone. It responded to truth, fear faced honestly, and the will to protect others. Helen saw it too, and her eyes widened with the look of a woman who had just confirmed an old memory. She stepped toward Kaito and shouted above the roaring crack, telling him that the blade was not just a weapon from the Old Kingdom. It was a key, and it could only unlock the seal if the bearer accepted the burden without greed. That was why so many warriors had failed before. They had wanted power. The blade would not answer that kind of heart. Myra looked toward Helen with sudden shock because she realized Helen had known more than she had said. Helen did not deny it. She had once worked beside the builders who forged the seal, and she had been sworn to keep the truth hidden until a worthy bearer appeared. Tom stared at her in disbelief, but he could not turn away from the shaking ground. Then a deeper sound rolled up from below, and the crack opened wider. A shape moved inside the light, not fully seen yet, but huge enough to cast a shadow across the chamber wall. Lord Vance smiled for the first time with clear satisfaction because he believed his moment had finally arrived. He ordered Drake to take the blade from Kaito, and Drake moved at once, though not with joy. His face tightened because he still believed in duty, but he no longer knew which side of duty was true. Drake launched forward in a fast silver blur, and Myra met him halfway with her drawn blade and a fierce step. Their clash rang through the chamber, hard and bright, and the force drove sparks across the floor. Myra was strong, but Drake was faster in the air, and he used that edge to force her back one step at a time. Tom rushed in from the side to break Drake's rhythm, using his shield and shoulder together, even with the broken strap dragging at his arm. He took the hit, grunted under the force, and still held his ground long enough for Kaito to stay centered near the seal. That was the kind of man Tom was. He did not shine, but he stayed. Vance raised both hands then, and silver light spread from the sigils on the chamber floor. His plan became clear in that instant. He had not only wanted the power below the seal. He had helped weaken the seal over time, feeding it controlled pressure through his court mages and stolen old notes, because he believed that if he could make the buried force wake under his command, the whole kingdom would bow to him without question. He had not come to save Westmere, he had come to own it. Myra heard that truth and felt it cut through her doubt like cold water. She had followed orders for too long, and now she saw the cost. She turned toward the soldiers who had entered behind Vance and shouted for them to remember who they served. Some hesitated, some looked away. A few guards lowered their weapons because they had grown tired of being used in a plan they did not trust. That hesitation mattered, and Vance saw it. His cold smile faded for the first time, replaced by a thin line of anger. He could not control people who had started to think for themselves. The chamber shook again, harder this time, and the giant shape below the seal pushed closer. Its outline was still unclear, but its presence made the air feel heavy and old. Kaito lifted the blade higher, and the light in the metal matched the line in the seal. Then Helen called out another truth. The buried power was not meant to be owned at all. It was a bound engine left by the first defenders of Westmere, built to protect the realm only if many voices chose the same purpose. One mind could wake it, but only a united heart could steady it. That was the hidden rule, and it changed everything. Kaito looked at Myra, Tom, and Helen, and then at the soldiers wavering around Vance. He understood the real battle was not only below the floor, it was in the people standing above it. His own fear had started the moment he was taken from Greyford, that rain-soaked modern city where he had once worried about small things and ordinary days. Now he was here, facing a kingdom that needed more than strength. It needed trust. He took one breath, then spoke clearly and told everyone to stop fighting for the man who wanted their future locked in silver chains. His voice was not loud, but it reached through the shaking chamber because it came from real courage. Myra answered first. She stepped beside him, lowered her blade, and ordered her remaining fighters to hold the line with him instead of against him. Tom nodded once and dragged his broken shield into place, standing where he could protect the others. Helen pressed both soot-marked hands against the floor near the seal and began to speak the old words she had kept hidden for years, words about balance, purpose, and the promise of Westmere. The living iron blade grew warm in Kaito's hands, then shifted again, not into a weapon for attack, but into a longer form that seemed built to guide light into the crack. Vance saw the shift and finally understood that he was losing control. He snapped an order at Drake, but Drake hesitated at the edge of a choice that had chased him for years. He had served Vance because he feared chaos and because order had always seemed safer than truth. But now he saw that Vance was the true chaos, the kind that wore a clean face and called itself wisdom. Drake slowed, then moved one step away from Vance instead of toward Kaito. That small act changed the whole room. It was not full redemption, not yet, but it was enough to break the shape of Vance's certainty. The seal blazed, and the chamber answered with a deep rolling pulse that shook dust from every wall. The shape below rose closer, and for one terrible second, everyone feared it would burst free without control. Kaito planted the living iron blade into the crack, just as Helen had taught him through her urgent words, and the sword lit the opening with a steady line of dark gold. Myra shouted for everyone to push their power into the same purpose, and the soldiers who had wavered now joined in by placing hands to stone, steel, and floor. Tom braced the side supports before they could collapse. Helen kept the words going, voice steady and strong despite the tremor in her knees. Then the buried power changed. Instead of exploding outward, it settled into a bright circle under the seal, as if the chamber itself had found its center again. Vance backed away with shock on his face because the future he wanted to own had refused him. He still stood dangerous, still cold, still proud, but his control had cracked in front of everyone. Drake lowered his head, torn and silent, while Myra stared at the seal with new understanding. The kingdom was not saved yet, not by a long stretch, but the worst failure had been stopped. The buried heart below Westmere was awake now, and it was listening. Kaito felt that in the blade, in the stone, and in the silence after the shaking. He also felt something inside himself change. He was no longer just the stunned boy who had been taken from Greyford. He had become someone who could stand in fear and still choose others first. Above the chamber, the ground kept trembling, and far off, alarms began to sound through Westmere. That meant more danger was coming, because Vance would not accept defeat quietly, and whatever had risen beneath the seal was only the beginning. Kaito held the sword steady, Myra took her place beside him, Tom stayed firm, and Helen watched the light with grim hope. Together they looked down into the glowing crack, knowing the next answer was still below them, waiting to be revealed. The chamber below Westmere felt like a broken heart buried in stone, and every tremor from above sent dust drifting through the dark air. The glowing crack in the floor pulsed with a cold, living light, and the strange hum from below made even the bravest breath feel careful. Kaito stood at the edge with the living iron blade in both hands, and the sword gave off a low pulse that matched the hidden light under the ground. He was a young man with black hair, fair skin, and a lean build, wearing a gray jacket, a dark shirt, and simple travel pants, and his stunned face had now become a serious one that would not turn away. Beside him, Myra held her ground with her blue-black hair tied back, her sharp eyes fixed on the crack, her strong, athletic build set under a dust-covered commander coat in dark armor, and her guarded pride was now mixed with hard concern. Tom stood a little behind them, a sturdy man with brown hair, weathered skin, and a battered guard uniform, his broken shield strap hanging loose as he kept his layered boots planted firmly. Helen was there too, a stocky woman with gray hair, soot on her face, strong hands, and a leather smith apron over a dark tunic, and she watched the light like a person reading a forge fire for danger. They all knew the same truth now, and it was simple and terrible at once. If the power below escaped the seal, Westmere would not stay standing for long. If Vance reached it first, he would use that power to grip the whole kingdom in his cold hand, and no one would be free again. Helen crouched near the crack and held her hand above the light without touching it. Her face tightened, because she had seen old seal marks before in the metalwork of the palace vaults, and she understood enough to fear the rest. She said the seal was not just a lock, but a warning shaped by people who knew the power could bend minds as well as stone. That made Kaito grip the sword harder, because he remembered how the blade had changed when he first touched it, shifting from a heavy dark iron sword into a sharper form as if it had chosen him. Helen looked at him and told him that the sword was made to answer the seal, not just to cut through enemies. That was the first new truth in the chamber, and it landed hard. Myra did not trust every word at once because she had learned to question miracles after too many battles, yet she could not ignore the way the sword pulsed when Helen spoke. Tom glanced upward when another tremor ran through the chamber ceiling, and far above them the alarm bells of Westmere kept crying through the broken streets. That sound meant Vance had already moved his forces, and it also meant Drake, his proud Sky Knight, was likely closing in from the Silver Road above. Drake was a man with red hair, sharp features, and a wiry athletic build, wearing silver Sky Knight armor, a winged cloak, and a fitted battle harness, and his severe face showed the same loyal pride that made him dangerous. Drake believed order mattered more than mercy, and Vance had taught him that fear could be called duty if it was dressed in enough silver. That was why he mattered, because he could arrive at any moment and turn a hard problem into a full battle. Kaito looked down again, and the crack widened just enough for everyone to see a deeper chamber below, lined with old black stone and thin silver lines that glowed in a slow pattern. It was not a pit. It was a machine of some kind, or something older than a machine, and the pattern on the walls matched the pulse inside the living iron blade. Kaito felt a strange pull in his chest, as if the sword and the chamber were remembering each other. Then the blade gave a sudden pull in his hands, and the metal lengthened for a breath, becoming thinner and more precise, almost like it wanted to point at the center of the chamber below. Myra stepped close and told him to stay steady, because she saw the movement and knew hesitation would cost them dearly. She was used to command, but this time her voice was not sharp with certainty. It carried doubt, and that made it more honest. Tom asked the question everyone had avoided: why would an ancient seal call out to a sword that had only recently awakened? Helen answered that the sword was not newly made. It had been forged with iron pulled from the same buried chamber, and the smiths who made it had hidden a purpose inside its shape. They had feared Vance before his line ever reached the throne. They had hidden the blade because they believed a ruler with hungry hands would try to take the chamber for himself, and they were right. That was the second truth, and it changed everything. The sword was not a random weapon. It was a key, and Kaito was the one holding it when the lock began to fail. Before anyone could speak again, a hard voice echoed from the tunnel behind them, smooth and cold and full of calm strength. Lord Vance had arrived below the chamber with 2 silver guards at his back, and his pale face carried the same cold smile that had haunted every battle since the first betrayal in Westmere. He was a tall, thin man with white hair, pale skin, and a silver court robe with dark trim and a polished mantle, and he stood like a ruler who had already decided the result. He did not shout. He did not need to. He said that Westmere was already wounded and that only a true leader could control what was hidden below. He spoke as if control and peace were the same thing, and that was how he always made his hunger sound noble. Vance revealed his motive at last, and it was simple enough to understand. The power under the seal could strengthen armies, break walls, and bind the will of those who touched it, and he wanted it because he believed fear was the only way to keep a kingdom from falling apart. He did not see that his own fear of losing power was the real wound driving him. One of his guards moved, and Tom stepped forward with his broken shield strap bouncing at his side, ready to block the path even if he had only half the tools he wanted. Myra drew closer to Kaito, and Helen straightened with a hammer in her hand, because she had picked it up from the chamber wall like a person reaching for an old friend. Vance then gave a small tilt of his head, and the silver guards stepped apart, revealing Drake behind them, standing silent with his armor shining in the broken light. Drake looked at Kaito, then at the sword, and something in his severe face shifted for a moment, as if even he had not expected this chamber to answer to the boy from Greyford. That was when the biggest twist in the chamber struck them all at once. Helen, working by the glowing lines on the wall, found a hidden panel and pressed a metal latch that only a smith would notice. The stone slid open, and behind it lay an old carving of the sword and the seal together in one image, along with words cut in simple script. Helen read them out slowly because the meaning was too important to rush. The sword was never made to open the seal for Vance. It was made to choose a bearer who would refuse the power if the choice became dangerous. The chamber had not been built to give someone control. It had been built to test the heart of whoever came seeking control. Kaito stared at the carving, and the truth hit him harder than any blow. He was not chosen because he was strong. He was chosen because he had already shown he could be afraid and still keep moving. That changed him in a way he could feel. His stunned face softened, then hardened again into courage, but now it was a calmer courage, not the wild kind that comes from panic. Myra saw the change and understood it at once, because leadership is not only about giving orders. It is also about standing beside someone when the truth gets heavy. Vance, however, was not willing to accept the meaning of the carving. His calm smile thinned, and for the first time his voice carried anger beneath the polish. He ordered Drake to take the sword, and he promised that every wall in Westmere would stand again if the power was placed in the right hands. Drake hesitated, and that hesitation mattered more than any cheer or shout. His loyalty had been built on pride, but the chamber had shown him that Vance was not protecting the kingdom. He was trying to own it. The ground shook harder, and a deep sound rolled up from below the seal, like a giant door trying to open from the wrong side. The silver lines on the chamber wall flashed brighter, and the living iron blade answered with a sharp pulse that filled Kaito's hands. He understood then that the sword was not only a key, it was also a promise, and that promise could either bind the power safely or let it run loose through the kingdom. Vance stepped forward at last, no longer pretending to be calm, and his guards moved with him. Tom raised his arms to hold the narrow path. Myra shifted into a fighting stance beside Kaito, and Helen planted herself near the stone panel with the hammer ready, in case the wall needed to be sealed again. Kaito lifted the blade toward the glowing crack, and the sword stretched once more into a longer, brighter shape, like iron waking from a long sleep. The chamber lit with harsh silver and deep black shadows, and every face was carved in sharp light and fear. Then Drake made his choice. He moved not toward Kaito, but across the chamber to block Vance, his winged cloak snapping behind him as he told his master that no ruler should force the realm into obedience through hidden power. That stunned even Vance, because betrayal always cuts deepest when it comes from someone trusted. Vance recoiled, then steadied himself with a cold glare, and the chamber filled with the first real clash of this new battle. Kaito did not strike, he listened. He felt the sword pulse in answer, and he understood that the next step was not victory but judgment. So he pressed the blade toward the seal, and the crack opened wider, spilling out a rush of wind and light from a deeper dark below. Everyone held their ground as the force rolled over them, and in that bright, shaking moment, Kaito saw a shape moving far beneath the chamber, something old, huge, and still not fully awake. The truth was clear now. The danger had never been only Vance. Vance had awakened something else, and whatever lay under the seal was waiting to be understood before it could be controlled. Kaito stared into the glow. Myra stood beside him. Tom refused to fall back. Helen guarded the stone, and even Drake remained in place, locked between loyalty and truth, while Lord Vance faced them all with a smile that no longer hid his fear. The chamber kept trembling, the light kept rising, and the next answer waited below, just out of reach, as Westmere held its breath above them.
The chamber under Westmere glowed with a cold light, and the air felt heavy enough to press against the skin. Dust drifted through the beams of silver light, and every stone in the floor seemed to hum with a hidden force. Kaito stood at the center of it all, his black hair damp with sweat, his gray jacket darkened by soot, and his stunned face slowly turning steady as he watched the seal below the floor. Mira stayed close on his right, her blue-black hair tied back and her sharp eye.
Westmere lay under a hard, gray silence, and the stone chamber beneath the ruined keep felt even colder than the night above. Dust drifted through the air in thin lines, and the weak light from the lower crack made every wall look sharp and strange. Kaito stood in the middle of that heavy stillness, with his black hair damp from sweat, his fair face pale, and his lean body held tight with fear and focus. Beside him, Myra kept her blue-black hair tied back and her strong shoulders square, because she was still the leader of their battered side and she wanted one thing above all else, which was to keep the group together long enough to save the kingdom. Tom, with brown hair, weathered skin, and a tired guard uniform, held his broken shield strap and watched the door with loyal worry, because he had seen too many broken walls to trust any new hope. Helen, a stocky woman with gray hair and soot on her face, wiped her strong hands on her leather smith apron and stared at the light like a craft worker judging a dangerous tool, because she knew that old metal and old magic often hid the same kind of trouble. Lord Vance was not in the chamber, but his name still hung over them like a cold blade, because the white-haired ruler in the silver court wanted the living iron blade for himself, and if he found this buried power first, he could force Westmere into a future of fear. Drake was also absent for the moment, yet his red hair, silver armor, and proud face were fresh in every mind, because he served Vance and wanted order through force, even if that order crushed everyone else. Then the lower door gave a long stone groan, and the bright line beneath it widened by a single breath, telling them that something alive, ancient, and fully awake now waited below. Kaito felt the sound in his chest before he understood it with his mind. The blade of dark iron in his hand pulsed once, then again, and the soft glow inside the metal answered the light under the door like two voices speaking in the same language. He had first found the living iron blade in confusion, and he had tried to command it like any other weapon, but the lesson from the last moment still held him steady now. Real power did not come from grabbing harder. It came from listening, from letting truth show its shape, and from accepting that fear could not be forced into silence. As he lifted the sword a little, the metal lengthened with a low hum and formed a cleaner edge, as if it were testing him. Myra noticed the change at once, and her sharp eyes narrowed with doubt and hope at the same time. She had never liked things she could not measure, and she had spent years leading by clear rules, yet this room was asking her to trust a boy who only recently entered her world. Tom shifted his feet and said that if the door opened by itself, then the thing behind it did not want to stay hidden anymore. Helen nodded once and said that hidden things opened for one of two reasons: either they wanted freedom or they wanted a witness. That simple thought made the room feel even more dangerous, because both reasons could change the kingdom. Then a voice rolled up from below, soft at first and deep as old stone, and it said Kaito by name. No one else heard an enemy in that voice, no one else heard a friend either. The door opened fully and a stairway spiraled down into a wide underground hall lined with black stone pillars and old silver inlays. The chamber below was not empty. In the center stood a tall shape wrapped in thin bands of light, like a guardian made from memory and metal, and around it lay broken cages, old chains, and the remains of a royal seal long cracked by time. Myra stepped in front of the others at once, because that was her habit and her duty, but the shape below lifted one hand and stopped her without any force at all. The voice returned, and now it was clear that it belonged to an ancient keeper bound to the blade and the seal beneath Westmere. It said the kingdom had once been protected by a pact between ruler and sword, but one king after another had feared that balance, because a ruler who needed listening could not command by greed. So the court had sealed the deeper chamber, hidden the truth, and turned the blade into a prize instead of a promise. Kaito felt the words strike deep, because they explained why the living iron blade responded to him now. It was not chosen by strength or blood, it was waking to someone willing to hear what the kingdom had buried. Helen looked toward the cracked seal and saw marks of old repair, which meant the prison had been maintained by human hands, not just magic. That meant the people of Westmere had been lied to for generations. Tom asked the only question that mattered, and his voice was rough but steady. He wanted to know what would happen if the seal broke. The keeper answered that the chamber below held the root of Westmere defense, a power that could shield the walls or turn every guard under Vance into a puppet if forced open the wrong way. Myra finally understood the full danger, and the proud set of her mouth tightened, because this was no longer only about a sword. It was about the freedom of the whole kingdom. Before anyone could answer, the stone above them shuddered hard and dust fell in small bursts from the stairway arch. Far away, through the thick walls, they heard horn calls from the outer fields. That meant the war had not paused at all. It had only waited. Drake had returned to the upper halls with orders from Vance, and now his troops were moving closer, because Lord Vance had sensed the opening of the lower chamber through his own spies and his own cold magic. His motive was no longer hidden. He wanted the living iron blade because it was not just a weapon. It was a key. With it, he could reach the root power below and bind the city defenses to his rule, then march through Westmere without ever needing the people to agree. He wanted a kingdom that obeyed in silence, because silence made control feel clean. That truth cut through the room faster than any blade. Kaito turned the sword in his hand, and the dark metal answered with a stronger pulse. The blade stretched longer, then split into a sharper shape at the edge, as if it was built to defend rather than dominate. The keeper said the sword would keep changing, but only while its bearer chose restraint over hunger. Myra heard that and looked at Kaito with a new kind of attention, because she had doubted him earlier, yet now she saw that his calm had a purpose. He was not trying to look strong. He was trying to stay honest. Helen moved to the cracked seal and touched the stone with careful fingers, then found a narrow ring of old writing that had been hidden beneath soot and dust. She read enough to understand that the lower hall had once been used as a shelter for the people, not a throne room for kings. That was the twist none of them expected. Westmere had not only been betrayed by Vance, it had been built, protected, and then quietly stolen from its own people by those who feared shared power. The chamber shook again, and this time the stairway above flashed with red light from approaching torches. Drake was coming, and he would not come alone. Myra drew a slow breath, then made the hardest choice of her night. She ordered Tom to hold the stair, Helen to guard the seal, and Kaito to speak with the keeper, because she finally understood that leadership was not about standing in front of everything. It was about placing trust where it would matter most. Tom gave a tired nod, set his broken shield strap aside, and took his place by the stair with grim loyalty. Helen tightened her apron and moved with the calm of a worker who had repaired worse than this in darker places. Kaito stepped closer to the bound guardian, and the living iron blade rose in his hand as if it could feel the truth in the room. The keeper explained that the final layer of the seal would respond only if the bearer accepted the burden of guarding, not owning, the chamber below. That meant Kaito had to choose what kind of power he wanted to carry. He felt the weight of Westmere in that single moment. He thought of the broken walls above, the tired guards, the farmers in the fields, and the people who had been told to fear the very thing that could protect them. Then he spoke clearly, and his voice did not shake. He said the blade would not belong to him, and the kingdom would not belong to Lord Vance. It would belong to the people who were willing to protect it. The sword answered with a deep silver glow, and the guardian bowed its head for the first time. But even as that happened, Drake reached the top of the stair and shouted for surrender, while the red glare of his armor filled the opening like a warning. Kaito lifted the changing blade, Myra stepped beside him with fierce eyes, and the whole chamber waited on the edge of the next clash, with the hidden power below still opening and the final answer still one step away. The chamber stayed still for one breath, while silver light and red armor faced each other. Below the cracked floor, the hidden power kept opening, and everyone knew this was the point where Westmere would either heal or fall forever. Kaito gripped the living iron blade with shaking hands, while Myra stood close beside him, ready to fight for the people who had trusted them. Tom held his broken shield strapped tight, and Helen stayed behind him with soot on her face and a steady look. They had all come this far because they wanted one simple thing, a future that did not belong to Lord Vance. Drake stepped forward in shining armor, and his sharp face hardened with cold pride. He said that Vance had ordered him to claim the blade because the kingdom needed control, not hope. That was the truth behind the attack, and it made the danger worse because Drake was not acting from rage alone. He believed order mattered more than freedom, and he was willing to crush anyone who stood in the way. Kaito looked at him and saw not just a soldier, but a man who had chosen fear over trust. Then the living iron blade changed again in Kaito's hands. The dark metal split into a longer shape, and the silver pulse inside it grew bright enough to fill the chamber. The guardian raised its head, and for the first time it moved aside instead of blocking the path. Myra understood the answer at once. The sword was not made to obey power. It was made to answer people who protected others without asking for reward. That was the twist, and it changed everything Kaito thought he knew. Kaito stepped in front of Myra, Tom, and Helen, and his fear finally gave way to courage. He told Drake that Westmere would not be owned by anyone who only wanted to rule it. Drake rushed forward, but the blade flashed silver and drove him back from the stair. The red glow of his armor faded as the chamber shook, and the hidden power below settled into calm light. Drake stared in disbelief, then retreated with his guard broken. Above them, the stone doors began to close, sealing Lord Vance away from the secret he had chased. Kaito lowered the blade, no longer stunned, and the others saw the change in him. He was not just surviving now, he was choosing to lead.